All right, we're good to go. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hit the recording button, Tessa?
It's recording. It just doesn't make the sound.
Oh, I see. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining the NATURA webinar series today. Today we have two presenters as always. First, we'll have Dan Childers at Arizona State University speaking and introducing the Central Regional Long-Term Ecological Research Project, which is part of the NSF's Long-Term Ecological Research Project. And then after that, we'll have Emma Rosi at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Services, introducing the Baltimore Ecosystem Studies. So thank you, Dan and Emma, for joining us today. And Dan, please take it away.
Thank you, Yuan. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay,
Sounds
so
good.
Emma and I decided to mess with that agenda a little bit. I should say, for starters, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you happen to be. So what we're going to do is not what you just saw, not what Yuan presented, but I'm going to start with a very quick overview of what the US LTER network is, and give you a hint about where urban fits into that network. Then I'm going to bounce to Emma, and Emma's going to talk about the BES Urban LTER program for a few minutes. She's going to bounce back to me. I'm going to present a little bit of info about the Central Arizona Phoenix LTER network. And then I'm going to highlight some of our very transdisciplinary research by showing you a short virtual field trip video. And so to get things rolling here, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. I'm going to assume everybody can see that.
Yes.
So we're going to, like I said, we're going to talk about first a quick overview of what the LTER program is in the United States. This is a map of the US LTER network sites. The network has been funded by the National Science Foundation since 1980. So some of the sites that you see here have actually been actively collecting ecological and environmental long-term research for 40 years now. They cover a variety of biomes, terrestrial, aquatic, and oceanic, and there are currently 28 of these sites in the network. 2 of them are explicitly charged with studying urban ecosystems using very broad interdisciplinary social ecological approaches. Those are, of course, Baltimore and Phoenix. And those are the 2 sites you're going to hear more about today. We have been funded since 1997, so we're starting our 24th year. But there are other sites in the network that, although they're not explicitly charged with studying urban processes, they do social ecological urban research in their programs in the cities where they are located. And you can see those sites circled here. And then there are other of the LTER sites in the US network that, while they're not explicitly located in cities, they are still studying social ecological dynamics in the communities in which they are embedded. And so it's important to remember when we're thinking about these communities that urban is not just about cities. At this point, I'm going to bounce to Emma and let her tell you more about the Baltimore Ecosystem Study LTER.
Great, thanks, Dan. And Dan's going to click through my slides. So I'm a scientist at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies, and I'm the director of the Baltimore Ecosystem Study. I should point out that these sites are funded by the National Science Foundation, and some things we do in common. There's a bunch of things that the LTER sites have in common. So like one of the ideas is that we would all measure some of the same dynamics in these ecosystems so that cross-ecosystem comparisons can be made. And there's a rich literature for the last 40 years of comparisons among these LTER sites. Okay, so next slide, please, Dan. So the Baltimore Ecosystem Study started in 1998. We are a long-term research of an urban ecosystem, as Dan pointed out. We focus on watersheds, urban forest canopy, animals, human environment interactions, And I'm going to show you the website link again. But if you're interested to learn more about the Baltimore ecosystem study, because I'm just going to give some like very quick highlights. And we've been doing this for 20, whatever Dan said, 24 years or something. And so I can't possibly talk about the rich literature that we've been doing for all these years in the BES. So I'm just going to focus on a few things that I think illustrate long-term research that sheds light on nature-based solutions and how people interact with their environment in Baltimore. So next slide, please, Dan. So again, the research areas, we characterize the urban ecosystem structure, meaning we have a lot of information about the road network and the forest canopy and the infrastructure. There's a lot of, we have many GIS layers, for example, that really characterize the urban structure and how that's changed over time. We have a focus on watershed hydrology and biogeochemistry that I'm going to talk about in detail to give you an example of these long-term data. We also study community assembly and sentinel species. So we have studied the birds very extensively in Baltimore. We've studied mosquitoes, interactions between mosquitoes and rats. We have 200 plots where we measure the forest tree canopy at our iTree plots, which is illustrated in that figure B up at the top. And then we also have been conducting telephone surveys every 4 to 5 years. We've called people and asked them about their environmental perceptions. So like their interactions and their perceptions of the environment in Baltimore. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those data as well. We also have a really important education program. We work with teachers, we support teachers, we do teachers trainings, we develop course materials, we've done schoolyard programs, we have something that we call the BES Data Jam. All of this, there's information on our website about all of these activities. The other thing I want to point out is that we did just recently publish a book by Yale University Press called Science for the Sustainable City. So if you're interested in learning more about the Baltimore ecosystem study, I highly recommend that in addition to our website as a place to look for all things Baltimore. Next slide, please. Okay, so Dan, I'm going to ask you to go through these. I have a bunch of animation, but so a central question in BES is what are the fluxes of energy, matter, in urban ecosystems, and how do they change over time? And in order to do that, if you click, we use the watershed approach. As Dan said, a number of these LTER sites have been around for a long time, and one of them is the Hubbard Brook LTER site, and it was a model for watershed studies. So if you click to the next slide, it's a way to study terrestrial ecosystems by studying the stream drainage, by putting a weir at the bottom of a watershed, and then looking at the quantity and quality, in particular the chemistry of the water that comes out of that watershed. So the Hubbard Brook watershed study is actually, I think we're in year 58 or something like that. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I highly recommend you go to the hbwater.org website. Next slide, please. And what we've done at Hubbard Brook is apply a watershed disturbance. So we cut down the forest, and then we look and see how much nitrate comes out of the watershed, or we add a liming agent and look and see how the trees grow in response. And this allows us to assess interventions, both experimental and natural, and it allows us to explore the long-term responses to subtle changes or big changes in the case of the experimental watersheds. Next slide, please. And so here's an example where it was Harvard. This is a classic example from ecosystem ecology. The forest was cut, and then you look to see the disturbed versus the undisturbed. And in this example here, you can see that when the forest was cut, nitrate started pouring out. Next slide, please. So we basically use the same approach in BES. We have watersheds that we have been studying. We measure the discharge. The US Geological Survey has continuous measures of discharge of coming out of these watersheds. And every week we go and sample the chemistry of the water. And this allows us to understand these ecosystems. And the disturbance we don't apply a disturbance. We observe what's happening in Baltimore in these urban watersheds. And so like the activities that are happening in the watersheds are our experimental treatments, if you will. And then we can explore the dynamics. Next slide, please. And so we basically have a bunch of watersheds in Baltimore, 8 watersheds. We have some reference watersheds that are forested. We have an exurban watershed with a number of exurban watersheds, so outside of the central area. And then we have urban watersheds. And we actually have a nested design. If you're interested in learning more, we could talk about it later. Next slide, please. And so you can click through these. We basically, as I already told you, we study these to explore the long-term dynamics. Okay, so now I'm going to give you some examples of what we can learn by doing that. So if you go to the next slide, please, Dan. So we can look, so this is an example of the nitrogen retention from these watersheds. So one thing that watersheds do, you know, there's nitrogen that comes in from atmospheric deposition or that we apply to the land, and we can look and see how much nitrogen is actually retained. And so in that green line at the top, basically most of the nitrogen that enters that watershed is actually retained within the watershed. So it doesn't come out the bottom of the watershed. And so basically the nitrate is then retained. When you increase the amount of urbanization in the watershed, you basically have less and less retention. So those watersheds are then sources of nitrate, which is an important pollutant to downstream ecosystems like the Chesapeake Bay that we study. And this graph is illustrating that there is a strong relationship between the nitrogen retention in a watershed and then precipitation. So as the precipitation in wet years, we get much lower rates of nitrogen retention, in particular in our urban watersheds. Whereas in the forested watersheds, you don't see any effect of precipitation, right? And so basically the N retention in forested watersheds is resilient to climate variability, but the climate variability, in particular precipitation, really affects the nitrogen retention in these watersheds. This matters a lot in this part of the country. It's predicted with climate change that we're going to have increases in precipitation, and nitrogen is an important pollutant. And so there's this important interaction, and the only way we'd be able to discern this is because at this point in 2015, we had something like 16 years of data. So we need lots of data on these phenomena in order to discern these important drivers of the ecosystem. Next slide, please. But one thing I want to make a side note, if you can click through, is that urban ecosystems are very bioreactive. So I know this network, there's a lot of people interested in urban ecosystems, and they're very bioreactive. And in fact, we wrote a review article where we took data from the literature, and we showed that the urban ecosystems in terms of nitrogen cycling dynamics are as reactive as non-urban ecosystems. So that graph that I showed you before, it's not that these urban ecosystems don't provide an ecosystem function. They do. They have a really important ecosystem service, but the heavy nutrient loading overwhelms the capacity of these watersheds to perform this ecosystem function. So when we're thinking about nature-based solutions, it's not just a matter of urban ecosystems are no longer functional. They are. They just can't keep up with what we're asking them to do. Next slide, please. So then we have a question, well, can nature-based solutions actually alter the nutrient exports from watersheds? And as I told you, in Baltimore, unlike Hubbard Brook, where we have experimental treatments, we can actually use the long-term record to examine the effects of installations of nature-based solutions. So click to the next slide. Basically, in Baltimore, in our watersheds, we didn't do this, but it was done in these watersheds. It's a bunch of best management practices, for example, for retention basins, permeable pavement, stream restoration were applied in these watersheds, and fixing of sewer leaks. I should also point that out. So that's an important solution that's, that was applied to these watersheds. Next slide, please, Dan. So for example, here's a, yeah, you can, this is fine, stay here. So the answer, I wanted to answer my question. Yes, our example is that long-term research demonstrates, because we had 20 years of data, we were able to look and see, if you can click to the graphs, Dan, we were able to see that when when we added, so on this graph that with the 4 panels, the cumulative BMPs, so like the best management practices that were in the watersheds, when the cumulative BMPs go up, the amount of phosphorus coming out of these watersheds declines. So basically, the BMPs in the watersheds, and again, I wanted to tell you this story because long-term data is the only way we're able to explore these dynamics. Because we had information from 20 years of data from these watersheds, and because these installations were happening over the long term, we were able to explore the influence of these nature-based solutions, and do they add up? And they do with phosphorus. Unfortunately, nitrogen, we didn't see any effects of the BMPs with nitrogen loading or export, but with phosphorus we did, and phosphorus is another important pollutant to downstream ecosystems. Okay, next slide, please, Dan. And now I want to shift gears a little bit and tell you about our study of human perceptions of the environment in urban settings. And so all of these dots on the map, that's Baltimore kind of in the center. All those spots are places where we have called people up on the phone over our 20 years and asked them questions about the environment. And I do want to give a shout out. This research is being led by our postdoc synthesis team, Elsa Anderson, Megan Fork, Lawrence Ling, and Lynn Dexter Locke and Amanda Supke. So every 5 years, we've conducted a survey of people in Baltimore. The respondents were asked, do you think, for example, X is a problem? Is air quality a problem in your neighborhood? Is water quality? Is safety a problem? Park quality, park availability? So we asked them those questions. And the important thing about these data is that we know the location of every respondent's home. So we know where they are because we did it spatially explicit. We kept the information. And so what we've done with our BS synthesis postdoc team is they've looked to see whether or not the perceptions of environmental quality are influenced by natural features. So we identified a 1-mile buffer around each respondent, and then we quantified within that buffer the canopy, the percent cover of canopy, bare ground, water, length of stream, distance to stream. So our hypothesis is, do people perceive water quality as an issue if they live close to streams? Or do they perceive air quality as a problem if they live close to parks? And so you keep going, Dan. And what we found is this was 5,000 respondents. What we found is indeed, we find a relationship between the percent cover of things like canopy cover and do they perceive problems. So as canopy cover goes up, on that first one with air quality, as they have more and more forest canopy, people think the air quality is less and less of an issue. I'll let that sink in. So when they live in a more forested area, they don't feel that the air is bad. When they live in areas where there's very little canopy cover, they feel that air quality is a problem for them. Same pattern is true for safety. When they have a very high, big, lush canopy cover, they feel that safety is not a concern. When canopy cover is really low, less than 20%, safety is a very big problem for, they believe that safety is a problem. What's interesting is it's a little different with water quality, that they perceive the more water the more water in the 1-mile radius of their home, the more they perceive water quality to be a problem. So it's sort of the idea that, well, if they live near water and see water all the time, they actually find that water quality is an issue. This is really exciting, brand new data that our synthesis team has pulled out. So I really wanted to share this with you because I think it provides us with some insights into how people are perceiving their environment near where they live. And yeah, next slide, that would be great, Dan. So I only had time to give you a few highlights of BES. I just want to stress that long-term research with a sustained effort can really help us understand and tease apart dynamics that would be very hard to know. You couldn't, in a 3-year typical grant from the National Science Foundation, know whether or not the installation of BMPs actually decreases phosphorus load. We couldn't understand the influence of climate if we had a short-term data set. And I do want to point out that all of our publications, which is many, couple thousand publications are listed. We have a database of all of our publications, and all of our data, including the telephone survey, the water quality, all of those data are available for download on our website. So if you're interested in looking at these data or querying the data for different things, I welcome you to come and check out our data. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma. So I'm going to give you a quick overview now of the other explicitly urban LTER program in the US-LTER network. I'm going to take a slightly different tack than Emma did. She demonstrated the incredible value of long-term urban social ecological data. I'm going to give you just a quick overview of what we do at CAP, how we organize ourselves, and then I'm going to allow some of our scientists to dig in a little deeper to one particular project that is going on right now. So like all LTERs, CAP, as we call ourselves, CAP-LTER is essentially a research platform. We've been funded by the NSF since 1997. We get funded, all LTERs get funded in 6-year grants. At CAP, as with BES, we're in our 4th phase of funding. We get a little more than $1 million a year from the NSF. It is a very broadly interdisciplinary program. We have actually here at ASU 9 different academic units that are involved in CAP research, and we have a number of scientists from beyond ASU as well. Where we are is Central Arizona, as our name implies. We study a very large area, 6,400 square kilometers, that is represented with the red quasi-rectangle that you see here. What is red in that quasi-rectangle is Sonoran Desert and the built-up Phoenix metro area you see embedded in gray. We've got about 4.5 million people that live here. We are in a very hot, very dry place, all right? So we get on the average of 20 centimeters of rainfall a year. This year, we did not have a summer monsoon season at all, and so our rainfall right now is hovering at about 10 centimeters for 2020. It's very hot. We had temperatures exceeding 110 degrees in Phoenix this summer for 54 days. This is the central question that we use to guide all of our research at CAP in our current phase of funding. And you can see that there's a focus on ecosystem services that are being provided by urban ecological infrastructure. And there's also an explicit cycling between the human component of the urban ecosystem and the environmental component of the urban ecosystem. And ultimately, our goal is to hope we can lead to a more resilient and sustainable future for Phoenix and for other cities. Like all LTERs, we have a central conceptual framework. This is ours. Some fundamental things that you see here is that we define the urban ecosystem to include everything human, right? People are the keystone species in a city. We design, build, and manage cities for our own habitat, right? So we are the ecosystem engineers. We are the beavers in the beaver pond. You can't study an urban ecosystem without studying people. I do want to highlight this bridge between the biophysical aspects of the urban ecosystem and the human aspects of the urban ecosystem, because this is central to the work that we're doing now. That's this concept of urban ecological infrastructure. I just want to dig into what that is a little bit more deeply here. So UEI, as we call it, urban ecological infrastructure, is a very broadly inclusive concept, and it includes all forms of nature in the city. So essentially, any urban infrastructure in the city that is capable of supporting ecological structure and function is UEI. So most of it is obviously designed, managed in some form, but there are accidental or undesigned and unmanaged forms of UEI in all cities. And we have that in Phoenix. As ecologists, we recognize that terrestrial ecosystems have very different structures and functions, and thus provide very different ecosystem services than, for example, aquatic systems. And so to differentiate different component or different categories of UEI, we use colors, just because it's easier. So terrestrial ecological features we refer to as green UEI or brown UEI. And so brown UEI is essentially unvegetated terrestrial ecosystem components. Aquatic ecosystems, which obviously are very different in terms of ecosystem services provided than terrestrial, we represent with blue. And then all cities have wetlands, and wetlands are ecologically both terrestrial and aquatic. or they are neither terrestrial nor aquatic. So they're in between the two. We keep wetlands in their own category of UEI, and it turns out when you combine the colors green and blue, you get the color turquoise. And so we refer to wetlands as being turquoise features. Now, because most UEI is designed and managed, that means that most UEI is actually a hybrid of both ecological and built components. And we represent that hybridity gradient with this particular figure here. And what you see here, the two green and brown terrestrial components of UEI at the top, aquatic blue UEI at the bottom, and then in between green and blue is the turquoise wetland UEI. On the far left here, what we have is UEI that is essentially 100% ecological or 100% UEI. On the far right here, you see infrastructure that contains really no ecological features at all. It still provides services, right? It's still important infrastructure, but it's purely gray. And the hybridity gradient that you see here then is a representation of the fact that as you go from left to right, a decreasing amount of the services provided by that particular type of UEI are being provided as ecosystem services. In CAP, we organize ourselves into 8 what we refer to as interdisciplinary research teams. And so if you are involved in CAP, whether you're a faculty member, whether you are a student or a postdoc, you belong to at least one of these categories. There are a couple of these that are fairly disciplinary, not terribly broadly interdisciplinary. Our what I call Birkenstock wearing ecologists like to live in the adapting to city life IRT. And our social scientists dominate in the governance and institutions IRT. The rest of these are very broadly interdisciplinary in terms of their, the people who are part of them. And then we have 3 of these that are actually very strongly transdisciplinary in the work that they do: the climate and heat group, the scenarios and futures group, and the urban design group. And what I want to do now is to show you a quick virtual field trip video. It's less than 10 minutes long, but it highlights a particularly transdisciplinary research project that's being done by predominantly folks in the climate and heat group and the urban design IRT. And so I'm going to bounce to another screen here to do this. All right. Can everybody see that? Yes, no?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, hey everyone, and welcome to the Edison East Lake neighborhood in the city of Phoenix. We're located just about 3 miles to the east of downtown. My name's Dave Hondula. I'm an associate professor in our School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning and one of the co-leads for our Climate and Heat IRT with CAP-LTER. Today the temperature's just crossed 100 degrees as it's about noon in mid-September, and while that would be hot by most standards, today is a breath of cool air. This summer we've shattered some of our heat records here in Phoenix, more than 50 days with daily high temperatures above 110 Fahrenheit. And it's against this backdrop of a warming climate in what was already the hottest large metropolitan area in the United States that CAP is deeply embedded in understanding how people and ecosystems are impacted by hot weather and other climate extremes, and also what people are doing to impact the nature of the heat we experience here in Phoenix. And it's those connections between people and the environment and ecosystems that bring us here to the Edison East Lake neighborhood. I'll flip the camera around just for a moment so you can get a sense of the surroundings. We are focused here in Edison East Lake because this neighborhood is slated for a massive redevelopment project in the coming years with a large investment from the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Authority. This will give us an unprecedented opportunity to understand how different design strategies can impact the urban climate at a scale on the order of multiple city blocks. This type of work has only been possible in a simulation environment previously. So CAP researchers from the Climate and Heat IRT, the Urban Design IRT, and others have really become embedded in a number of processes happening here and around the Edison East Lake neighborhood. And we'd like to introduce you to some of those over the next few minutes and give you a bit of a tour around the neighborhood. We're going to meet a graduate student who's doing some modeling work, trying to understand the climate dynamics in this area. We're going to see some of our monitoring capabilities that we've deployed here in Edison East Lake, and we're going to introduce you to our friend Marty, who's really helping us understand urban environments like never before. So we hope you look forward to this tour, and let's head inside for a few moments to cool off with Peter to tell us about some of our modeling efforts.
Oh, hi there. I'm Peter Crank. I'm a PhD candidate here at ASU, and we're here in the Shade Lab where we study the thermal environment and how the buildings, the neighborhoods are affecting the heat as well as other atmospheric variables that we experience. So what we specifically are studying here with this project is the Edison Eastlake neighborhood, which is a neighborhood in central Phoenix that the city has deemed ready for redevelopment in their public housing projects. And so what we are doing is we are modeling and measuring both what the neighborhood currently is to see what the thermal environment is for these residents as it currently stands. But then we're also looking to see what the proposed changes are and how those would affect the thermal environment, how it could make things cooler, more comfortable for residents, the concerns that the residents may have. This is the type of work that we frequently do. And in this project specifically, we are considering how the incorporation of that green space can affect both the thermal conditions, i.e. how warm or cool it is, but also how that affects the overall mental well-being of the community.
We're complementing the modeling work you heard described by Peter with efforts to monitor the weather and climate in the Edison Eastlake neighborhood. And our monitoring efforts are intended to fill two critical roles. One, provide a rich source of validation data that Peter and other CAP scientists can use to understand how well those fluid dynamics models are behaving and how we might improve them. We'll also be looking at the weather data over the long term to see what types of changes are actually realized in terms of microclimate impacts that could benefit the residents here. We have a handful of weather stations that are mounted on utility poles like the one we're coming upon here. You can see we have an outdoor hobo sensor just up on the light pole there. We also have two rooftop weather stations in Edison Eastlake, and those are measuring the full suite of weather parameters, including wind speed and direction and solar radiation. But perhaps our most interesting and innovative efforts to monitor microclimate conditions here come in the form of our friend called Marty. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to my colleague Jenny, who will introduce you to our mobile weather station.
Hi, I'm Jenny Vanos of the School of Sustainability, and this is our urban biometeorological cart. It can tell us everything about what a human is experiencing based on the thermal and radiative environment. So each sensor here can measure different parameters of the environment. We have 3 net radiometers that are measuring incoming and outgoing.
Is the video not working, folks?
And this is Elizabeth. It's frozen on my screen.
Yeah.
I hear the audio though.
Well, I'm not real sure. I guess, let me try it again. At what point did it freeze, Elizabeth?
I'm on minute 306. I mean, the audio's been running, but the
might want to go to the start of the Marty.
All right,
yeah, that'd be good.
But perhaps our most interesting and innovative efforts to monitor microclimate conditions here.
You may have to unshare your screen and reshare.
My colleague Jenny will introduce you to our mobile weather station.
All right.
When sharing, there should be an option to optimize for streaming video as well on that screen, and that should help.
Yep, that's probably the problem. Let's try that.
Jenny Vanos of the School of Sustainability, and this is our urban biometeorological cart. It can tell us everything about what a human is experiencing based on the thermal and radiative environment. So each sensor here can measure different parameters of the environment. We have 3 net radiometers that are measuring incoming and outgoing long and shortwave radiation. We also have UV sensors to tell us about the ultraviolet radiation in the environment. This sensor measures temperature and relative humidity. We have wind speed and direction, and then of course we have the location, so we know the exact location of where all these measurements are taken, and we can integrate this into values to tell us about a human's experience in especially an urban environment. And so we use this cart in a lot of our extreme heat and urban design studies to try to understand the influence of surfaces and shading and surface types on a human's experience. So Paul Casio will now tell us a little bit more about the Urban Design IRT.
The Urban Design IRT has been working in close collaboration with other IRTs to establish, maintain, and expand several key partnerships that are central to the Urban Design IRT work, but nothing really more substantial than the partnership on the revitalization of Edison Eastlake with the City of Phoenix. Edison Eastlake really is that unique opportunity at the neighborhood scale to better understand those governance and institutions that support the design of sustainable and resilient urban ecological infrastructure. Being embedded within the planning and design process from the earliest stages really has provided the opportunity to put past CAP data, long-term data, into action as part of the project. Also, it's offered the opportunity to innovate around new forms and new methods, particularly in terms of things like the heat walks, to really inform design. It's also allowed us to, secondly, to measure the pre and then after the construction, the post conditions within this neighborhood at a scale that is really important for urban climate. And then finally, and perhaps the most important, is to really think about how we can have an evidence-based urban design approach of an urban ecology for cities that really influences that microclimate outcome for the health, wellness, and equity issues within our cities.
The last highlight we'd like to share with you from our work here in Edison Eastlake is that we conducted a community heat walk here 2 Septembers ago on a hot day like today. This was an event we put together in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and our local Museum of Walking. And the heat walk involved residents and the Marty Cart taking a 1-mile walk through the neighborhood with a real focus on the thermal environment, thermal conditions, and human perceptions. As our residents moved through the neighborhood, accompanied by researchers who were conducting walking interviews, we heard from them about how they felt about the environment, how much shade they perceived to be, what features they thought could improve the neighborhood. And we also collected critical biometeorological data about their thermal sensation, about their thermal preference in these field guides. We stopped at about 10 different locations in the neighborhood and asked them a predefined set of questions that we could use as social measures to compare against the environmental data we were collecting. This was one of our stops early in the walk here in Edison Park, but let's head to the other side of the neighborhood to look at a contrasting case where people said they felt much different, but the environmental conditions were in fact identical. And here we are on Van Buren Street. It's loud. This is a busy surface street. Although it was measured to be just as hot as Edison Park, people here said they felt hotter, said they felt less comfortable. And we think the critical factor of perceived control of the thermal environment influenced their scores in that manner. People here just have a harder time finding relief from the heat, and even if they're not standing in the shade, the absence of shade, the absence of the opportunity for shade makes them feel hotter. This is just one example of how we're trying to combine physical and social science to understand what types of design strategies are important for improving quality of life here in this Phoenix neighborhood. Well, that wraps up our site visit to Edison Eastlake. We hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about what CAP is doing here. And I'll just reiterate the tremendous opportunity ahead of us here in Edison Eastlake as we see this massive redevelopment take place over the next few years. It's already been incredible seeing how this project and this neighborhood has been a platform for bringing together different CAP researchers, bringing new researchers into the CAP family. The work that's happening here is connecting us to professional practitioners, community-based organizations, other non-governmental organizations, as well as city staff, and of course to residents themselves. We see what's happening here as a wonderful bridge between CAP and community members themselves. We look forward to updating you over the coming years on what's happening here, and we hope you'll tune in to our social media feeds, to our academic publications, and other communication channels. Again, thanks so much for taking the time to join us here in Edison Eastlake. And with that, we will take you off to another part of the wonderful world of CAP.
Okay, that's all we have. I apologize for the technological glitches. You would think after doing Zoom for 9 months that I would actually know how to do it. But we have, I believe we have almost 20 minutes if anybody wants to ask questions of Emma or me, start up a discussion. Y'all are in charge.
Thank you, Dan and Emma. And please feel free to ask questions to Dan and Emma. Or any comments, thoughts. So
Yohan,
there
maybe
is a
just to
question.
start,
Yeah.
there's some comments and questions. Okay, you're on it. Great.
Yeah. So there's a question in the chat here that Mariana from at Plan of the Depth asking, could you elaborate on how urban design can lead to or reduce spatial inequalities, for example, in terms of access to the green and blue spaces?
How urban design can sorry, Yuan, can reduce what kind of inequality?
Can lead to spatial inequalities or reduce inequalities, spatial inequalities in terms of access to the green and blue spaces.
Wow. Well, I'm probably not the person to be answering that question. Certainly one of the things that our urban design group has really worked very hard to do is to use a co-production design model where they are, as landscape architects and engineers, where they are actually embedded in the design process. And so in a true transdisciplinary ecology design nexus of co-production model, people who have been practicing landscape architecture are working with the decision makers at the municipal level, and for example, in the case of Edison Eastlake, but also even more importantly, working with the people who live there, right? And so my understanding is that the people who are living in this public housing project will be the residents once the new project is completed. And so if they know what the environment that they're living in is like now, they can provide very real input on what they think their environment should look like in the future design. And so I don't know that that's necessarily an answer to the question, but it's a difficult thing. I mean, design involves anything from a single parcel to multiple city blocks to entire neighborhoods. And the trick is that it not be done in a vacuum, that it not be done in a void.
Dan?
Yes.
I was just going to add that we do know that one of the main things that, in terms of heat, that distinguishes different physical locations within the city in terms of vulnerability to heat is the extent of canopy of vegetation. And so urban design that manipulates or changes the extent of vegetation. And this is, you know, for a lot of the outdoor things, that's a big focus, is, you know, on where can we put shading structures and vegetation and so forth, so people experience heat differently in the environment.
Right, and on the tour of that neighborhood that Paul gave in the video, you saw actually Edison Park, which is part of that neighborhood. It's a city park, and it's pretty lush. And in fact, Paul was driving through it in September, right after it had been flood irrigated, and you could see pools of water. So there is access to that green space for the folks in this neighborhood.
Thank you, Dan. There's another question in the chat here. Many thanks from Pedro Pinho. Many thanks for the presentation. How does your data analysis deal with citizen science data? That data is likely to come from random sites in the city rather than from your pre-established points. How do you cope with this difference?
You want to start that one, Emma?
Well, so we don't necessarily, I'm trying to think of how we incorporate citizen science data within our data. We haven't done that, but we do have, like, we work with networks, we work with students, for example, and it's not quite citizen science, but it's we work with a team of students. We call it our BES-Yes program for students in the city in the summer. They can become interns, and actually we give them protocols and they actually help us collect data. So we're not harvesting other citizen science data, we're actually engaging with high school age kids to actually collect data for us with protocols, with data that our scientists are interested in. So that's not quite an answer to your question, but one thing we do try, if it's possible, we always like to try and harvest data and use it in different ways. And there was a question earlier that I'll just answer in that. So in Baltimore, we have our 200 points that we've been measuring for 20 years of forest canopy, but our postdoc Elsa Anderson found that there's also in Baltimore an urban street trees catalog. So all the urban street trees, we know its species, what health, da da da. And so she's trying to pull together, so it's different types of data that we're always trying to pull together to answer our socio-ecological questions. And I think that's a challenge in urban areas and something that's exciting to work on. Like, how do we pull together data that we intentionally collected versus data that were not collected for this reason, but may provide us with additional insights. So that's, I think, one of the exciting things about doing urban ecological, socio-ecological.
So one of the citizen science projects that we have going on here at CAP, and just by the way, one of the things that is a little problematic with that term here in Arizona is the term citizen. So we prefer to use other terms to refer to that. But one of our projects here involving residents is a project that has expanded our ground-dwelling arthropod long-term data set to the McDowell Sonoran Preserve, which is one of our large regional desert parks here. And the people who live in Scottsdale near that park collect ground-dwelling arthropod samples using our protocols, and then our entomologist sorts those samples. We can provide the data back to them, and they use those data to help better manage their park. And so that's pretty cool. I do want to point out, when we think about, I'm going to say resident, not citizen, but resident involvement in science, Emma talked at length about the every 5-year phone survey that they do at BES. Every 5 years, we do a Phoenix area social survey. It's not a phone survey, but it is a very similar design. And it's not accidental that both are done every 5 years. But when you think about it, what we're doing there is we're generating data on a wide array of people's perceptions, people's values, people's decision-making. And so that is actually residents being involved in the science. It's not what we classically think of people, keeping track of the birds in their backyard or looking with buds burst, but it is residents being involved in science.
Thank you. Next question from Hee-Jun Chang. How did you delineate wetlands boundary, since wetlands might change over season, dry versus wet season? In other words, how did you differentiate wetlands from water at different times of the year?
I'll start that one because I think that may be more directed at me. So that's an excellent question. I've spent my entire career studying wetlands. From an ecosystem perspective, I spent almost 15 years working in the Florida Everglades before coming to ASU more than 12 years ago. And I was very happy and surprised to find out when I got to the desert that we actually do have wetlands here. The wetlands that we have here in the Phoenix area are either constructed wetlands. So for example, we have a large constructed treatment wetland where we've been working for more than 10 years. That's part of the city of Phoenix's largest wastewater treatment plant. Its boundaries are very clearly delineated because it is very constructed and very engineered. The other kinds of wetlands that we have here, and we have a lovely virtual field trip video about them as well, is what we call accidental wetlands. So this is a form of UEI that I referred to as unmanaged and undesigned. And it turns out that, so the Salt River bed, the Salt River, which flows through the center of the Phoenix Valley, has not been a perennial river since the late 1930s. And in fact, there are large stretches of the Salt River where the riverbed is completely dry. But there are places where the Salt River bed is home to very lush and productive wetlands. And these are places where the storm drains that drain the city into the Salt River are draining a large enough storm watershed that they run constantly, right? So even in a desert city, our city is leaky, and if a storm drain has a large enough watershed that those storm drains constantly are running water into the riverbed, what forms there, because that's what wetlands do, are accidental wetlands. And we've been studying those wetlands for quite some time. And so it's a lot easier to delineate the boundaries of wetlands when you're in a desert than it is when you're in a more mesic climate. And maybe, Emma, maybe you want to talk about how y'all deal with wetlands at Baltimore?
Yeah, well, I guess I won't talk about how we deal with wetlands, but maybe how we dealt with that BMP, that study where we looked at the percent coverage of BMPs. And what we did is a couple year basically synthesis of combing through information that the city and counties had compiled on installation, fixing sewage infrastructure, installations of BMPs. You know, it was a pretty big undertaking to figure out, like, to compile all those data in and figure out within each of the watersheds how much installation of BMPs occurred. And so, you know, again, that's marrying data from that were collected and compiled for a very different reason than what we used it for. And so that was, again, a multi-year effort by a number of people to pull and synthesize all those data to then get one number to compare with our phosphorus load and nitrogen load. So, but again, it's this, in urban areas in particular, there can be lots of dimensions of different types of data that might be useful for doing these types of analyses. And in Baltimore, we really try and compile those data in ways that can help us answer novel questions.
Thank you, Anna. So next question from Elvia Melendez Ackerman. Can you elaborate on the sampling design to relate the local heat environment measurements to human perception of heat environment? So sampling design for local heat environments and the human perception.
I assume that's a question for Dan. Go ahead, Dan.
You're evil, Emma. I think, so one of the things, this obviously is dealing with our social surveys, the phone survey in Baltimore.
I think she's asking about the heat measurements, the Marty cart and,
oh,
is that right, Elvia?
That's what I think too.
Yes.
Oh. Yeah, so they measure globe temperature, which is sort of more close to what people are experiencing, but also they did this heat walk where people actually recorded their perceptions of heat, and then they had measurements at the same time. So that's how they can translate that information.
So it's a comparison of real data on what a wide variety of microclimate parameters that a human body is experiencing. That's what the Marty card gives you. Combined with asking people what they think they're feeling, right? Or how they are perceiving their environment. And in the example Dave gave, they were two different places where Marty was throwing back the same data, that the microclimate was essentially the same, but because they were standing on a busy street, busy loud street, and there wasn't any shade anywhere around, everybody felt hotter. The reality was they weren't experiencing hotter conditions, but they felt hotter. And so that's sort of the social ecological marrying of those two different types of data.
How intensively do you, I mean, what kind of replication goes into that? Are you able to sample that throughout the year? Are you able to do that in multiple places? Thank you.
Yeah, there's actually, I think that there's at least 2 Marty carts now. It's so popular. And the CAP researcher who actually came up with that idea just got an NSF career grant. So she's delving into this much more deeply. There are poor graduate students who drag Marty all over the city, all times of the year, all times of the day. And it's really pretty amazing. There's a very interesting focus on access to, for example, public transportation. And how hot light rail stops are, how hot bus stops are, what the conditions are for somebody to walk from, for example, Edison Eastlake to the 12th Street light rail station or to the nearest bus stop. And on some of these city streets where people are walking to just go get on a bus, we've measured temperatures of 150, 160, 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Marty doesn't lie about these things. And so it's easy to replicate it. And our climate and heat folks are doing an awful lot of that. And what we need to absolutely acknowledge is that a lot of that Marty cart dragging in those extreme temperatures is being done by our very energetic and virulent graduate students.
Thank you. Next question is from Bonnie Killer. For both CAP and the Baltimore LTERs, have you heard from residents in the Edison East Lake or the neighborhoods with GI in Baltimore ecosystem studies who are concerned about gentrification associated with the proposed improvements in environmental quality?
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at that. So although I'm like racking my brain to think about their telephone survey, which I told you one question, but it's like 8 pages long. So I don't think that we ask people in the telephone survey about perceptions of gentrification and issues of that. But although I'm happy to go back and check, I don't know that we think about that or we've asked about that. But I do want to point out that we have another project that Timon McPherson is involved with, which is looking at green infrastructure and the social perceptions of green infrastructure in addition to where green infrastructure has been built in Baltimore. And so we have a whole, I could point you to that team who's been looking at, like basically, is green infrastructure a universal good is the fundamental question. Is it, are there equity issues around green infrastructure's installation, where it's being put, burden on communities to maintain it and whether or not it's actually perceived as a positive or a negative. So there's that. And then to answer the second question, so if you're interested in learning more about that, you could ask Timon or follow up with me on that project. But then also I want to point out that the second question about evidence, whether or not in Baltimore people are there higher property values with certain measurements of water quality. There was a couple really nice studies done by Alina Irwin, looking, and I can pass those along or share them with people if they're interested, looking at the influence of stream restoration on housing values. And so we actually, Alina Irwin, our economist in Baltimore, spent a lot of time compiling all that information is kept track of, the transactions and the sale of housing. And what she found, and it's going to give you this little nugget, is that stream restoration nearby a house actually increases the value of the home if it's on publicly accessible land. If it's not public and it's not providing any like social amenities like a park or a path or something, then it actually doesn't improve the value of a home. But your proximity to stream restoration increases the value if it's public. So that's sort of an interesting finding. Again, having these kind of data and compiling very different types of data sets involved.
So
thank you, Emma.
The issue, I know we're out of time here, but I'm really quickly, I'm going to bounce to you in a second here, Elizabeth, but the issue of gentrification is actually a big deal in another minority underserved neighborhood where we've been doing a lot of work over the years here at CAP, and that is South Phoenix. The issue of gentrification in South Phoenix, though, is not about UEI or open space, it's about the light rail extension through their neighborhood. That neighborhood is where we've been doing our scenarios and futures work. And Elizabeth is one of the leaders in that program. And Elizabeth, maybe you could really quickly just talk about how gentrification relative to urban ecological infrastructure has come up in discussions in the workshops that y'all have held in South Phoenix.
Well, I'll just say that it definitely is coming up in that we had developed a whole scenario around the topic of just green enough and thinking about how we can improve the quality of green space and the amount of green space in cities or in that neighborhood without increasing gentrification, which, as you all know, is a huge challenge. So it's definitely an ongoing conversation that we're having. And I'll stop there because I
Thank
know
you.
we're out of time. Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Emma, for joining us and great presentations. And thanks everyone for the questions. We have some more questions in the chat we couldn't address because of the time, but we'll address this.
Mostly
We'll
discussion.
hand over this, to the speakers and possibly communicate through the emails as well. So thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good day. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.